So good afternoon and welcome. These were troubled times. People were sick, their neighbors were fearful. Should we isolate the afflicted? No one wanted to be near the sick for fear of catching their illness. Fear was on everyone's tongue and on their mind. People were talking about it everywhere and all the time. And public officials could offer no answers. There were a few people in whom the public could trust, and all this left people with a sense of anxiety and confusion. As cities and towns neared hysteria, irrational behavior became the norm. The terror was arbitrary, and no one considered themselves safe. Society was shaken to the core. Now, am I describing a societal reaction to COVID-19? I might as well be. No, not at all. I'm describing Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. You see, human nature changes little, whether it be in 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, or in March. Do you remember those days in mid-March of 2020? Or for that matter, even today. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make all of them yourself." And the primary accuser of witches said in those days, years after she helped start this shameful time in human history, "Who will forgive us? Who will forgive us?" Let's start this afternoon by exposing 5 myths about the Salem Witchcraft Trials. Myth number 1. The convicted witches were burned. No one was burned. Historically, witches were burned in France, but hanged in England. And with but one exception, all of those convicted in Salem were hanged. The exception was Giles Corey, an old farmer who was pressed to death. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Second, the victims were all women. Now, there can be no doubt that the witch hunts that occurred in the 1400s and 1500s in Europe targeted women also almost exclusively. But Salem was different. Of the 19 people hanged in Salem, 4 were men, including a carpenter and a 42-year-old Harvard-educated minister. The accused were a motley group from the richest of Salem's merchants to the wife of a blind farmer. Myth number 3, the panic all occurred in Salem, Massachusetts. Actually, none of it did. It began in Danvers, Massachusetts, and the most severely affected town was actually Andover, about 15 miles from Salem. In Andover, if you can believe it, 1 in 10 people was accused of being a witch. Now, the accusation spread throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony and involved 24 different towns, including Amesbury, Ipswich, Gloucester, Salisbury, and Topsfield. Salem's main contribution was that that's where the trials took place, all right? Myth number 4. Superstition was the driving force. Actually, misguided religiosity was the driving force. It was those who believed in the Bible who most fervently also believed in witchcraft. Ministers and civic officials read and studied witchcraft literature. They thought they were acting out of reason. Massachusetts in 1692 was highly literate, and what book with which was were people most familiar with? The Bible. Literacy and piety played greater roles in the crisis than did ignorance and superstition. Myth number 5. Ergot poisoning was to blame for the witchcraft trials. Now, this is an interesting and provocative theory that emerged in 1976, that a contaminated supply of rye introduced ergot poisoning in Salem, in the Salem area, causing convulsions and hallucinations. You see, if we can blame the rye, we can exonerate everyone else. We might have a diagnosis to explain the accused who complained of prickling skin. They flung themselves around a room, crashed to the floor, or fell into a trance. Some of the behavior of the accused is indeed consistent with ergot poisoning, but two quick points undercut this theory. First, those accused of being a witch shared their meals with other non-hallucinating adults, brothers, and sisters. And second, those accused of being a witch shared the same coordinated set of hallucinations, which some scholars said were probably caused by an overactive imagination. It's highly unlikely that many of the accused had exactly the same set of hallucinations. Now, there are many other reasons to discount the ergot poisoning theory. I'll address them later. Suffice it to say, however, that this theory offers a very simple explanation for a host of oddities. And it also allows us to shift the blame from people to an inanimate object and gives us a tidy answer to resolve a centuries-old mystery. But life is not so simple. So let's return in time to colonial Salem, meaning the Salem and its environs in the late 1680s and early 1690s. You have to understand that this part of the country had barely been 60 years old. There was wilderness all around. Farm settlers lived an isolated existence and were probably actually pretty lonely. They were living actually on the very edge of civilization. It was a hard life and not for the faint of heart. And this is the stock from which we are an independent lot, all of us here in New England, you think? We're different and we know more than anybody else in the country, yes. Oh, no question about it. But this is the stock from which we are derived. Now, to their credit, they were a hardy people. Life and the elements were much too cruel to permit them to survive otherwise. So let's introduce the characters in this afternoon's story. The first character was a fellow by the name of John Putnam. There he is. He was one of the elders of the Salem village, and he invited a fellow to give talks at the local church in order to make a bid, so to speak, for the services of the minister to try to get him to hire him as their minister. But the fellow's name, by the way, was Paris with two R's. But negotiations with Paris over pay and benefits dragged on for about a year. Paris eventually moved to Salem Village with his wife, family, and their slave Tituba, who was a native from Barbados. Let's see. At this time, Salem was in the midst of change. Prominent people were less willing to serve as public leaders, and two families, the Putnams and the Porters, were fighting for control of the village and the pulpit. The pulpit was very important to people in colonial America. And now, Salem was by far the busiest port in Massachusetts, and its trade volume vastly eclipsed Boston's. Here's a sketch which really does not do justice to the Salem Harbor. When I say that Salem Harbor was full of ships, this is a very poor recreation of how it really looked. It is said that it was so congested with masts and ships that you could see very little of the harbor itself. And so, it was an exceptionally cold day of 1692, January 1692. Please remember that. When Minister Paris's 9-year-old daughter and her young cousin became seemingly strangely ill. They dashed about, barked like dogs, dove under furniture, contorted in pain, and babbled nonsensically. Here are the two girls. They look pretty innocent, don't they? Reverend Parris took the two girls to a local physician and another minister, and they examined the girls and agreed on a diagnosis: witchcraft. Now, in order to understand that diagnosis, we need to know two things about 1692 Massachusetts. First, there was a widespread belief that Satan was real, that he acted in this world, that he was close at hand at all times, and that he caused disease and misfortune. And secondly, this book had just recently been published, just before the Salem Witchcraft Trials, which told the story of an Irish washerwoman in Boston who was a witch. And Parris's daughter behavior, they thought, mirrored that of the Irish washerwoman from Boston. Always blame the Irish, right? The colonists knew that they were, at the time, living a brittle life. A war with the native population was raging less than 70 miles away at the time, and death and disease were often at their door. They believed that they were living on the very edge of civilization. Soon, other girls started acting similarly. The doctor examined those girls and too concluded with the same diagnosis: witchcraft. Now, why? Because witches targeted children. The number of girls acting this way grew. They contorted into grotesque poses, fell into frozen postures, and complained of biting and pinching. And these last complaints were often associated with Satan's conduct, pinching. It wasn't very long before the community became obsessed with this terror. The first three to be accused of witchcraft were Sarah Good on the right, Sarah Osborne on the sharp left, and Tituba, the slave from Barbados. Now, Good was a beggar and considered a social misfit. Osborne was old and quarrelsome and hadn't attended church in a year. There's a good reason. And Tituba was a slave. So, sounds like grounds for an accusation of witchcraft. The Putnams brought complaints against the three women before county magistrates. The preliminary examinations were scheduled to be held in a tavern. That's where a lot of meetings were held in the old days, because that was the biggest place. But hundreds of people wanted to attend, so they had to move the proceedings to a meeting house. And the three girls said that they had been attacked by specters and acted out a series of coordinated contortions. Villagers then came forward to report mysterious cases of missing cheese, missing butter, and animals born with deformities. And the magistrates asked the accused the same questions over and over. Are you a witch? Have you seen Satan? And if you aren't a witch, how do you explain your contortions? Now, the hearing might have ended with a simple warning, but then Tituba, after first denying that she was a witch, thought she might be made the scapegoat, and then claimed suddenly that she had been approached by a tall man from Boston, obviously Satan, shown here, and she was asked to sign the devil's book and do his bidding. She admitted that she was a witch, and so too were the other accused. Her confession silenced most skeptics, and ministers started hunting witches with zeal. Tall man from Boston, sounds like me. It could be me. A 4-year-old girl was arrested and kept in jail for 8 months. She watched her mother carried off to the gallows, cried her heart out, and went insane. The governor created a new court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer. You see the words Oyer? Oyer is an old English term, and terminer, oyer means to hear, aural, A-U-R-A-L, and terminer means to determine, to hear and determine. This was a special type of court under English law established to hear extraordinary and serious cases. And the court was comprised of 8 persons. Now, although they were called judges, none of them had any legal training, headed by this fellow, Chief Justice Stoughton, William Stoughton, who was a self-proclaimed witch hunter. Stoughton and the other judges credited confessions coerced by torture. They admitted spectral evidence into evidence. And what is that? That's testimony by which people who had been visited in their dreams or had visions of the defendant's specter. And they also allowed the so-called touching test into evidence. If you touch the defendant and it stopped the quivering of the individual, then that person was a witch. All quite scientific, don't you think? The judge examined women's bodies for moles or blemishes which were considered the mark of the devil. In other words, evidence that today we would consider as utterly preposterous was considered routinely and admitted in a trial for witchcraft. And the judges also allowed dreams, visions, speculation, suspicion, gossip, hearsay, and stories into evidence. In short, it was an evidentiary hell. Most accused witches were not told that they had a right to a lawyer. They weren't permitted to have witnesses testify in their own behalf, and they had no right of appeal. They were permitted to speak for themselves, and they did have the right to produce evidence and cross-examine their accusers. Now, the first to be tried was a 60-year-old woman who owned a tavern. Her crime was that she allowed her patrons to drink cider ale and play shuffleboard on the Sabbath. She was also highly critical of her neighbors and slow to pay her bills. The court heard bizarre evidence and based on that, convicted her. One of the 8 judges, a Nathaniel Saltonstall, was aghast at the guilty verdict and immediately resigned from the court. The woman was carted off to the gallows and hanged. And within a few months, the number of accused witches surged to more than 200. The accused varied in age from 4 to 71. At first, they targeted social outcasts, but later respected church members. John Alden Jr., the son of Captain John Alden of the Mayflower, was accused. And landowners were also accused if they had property that was envied for ownership. The reason being, if you were convicted of being a witch, your property was forfeited to the state and your neighbor could bid on it and buy it at a low value. Now, because witches were considered dangerous, they were kept. This is a photo of a dungeon where the witches were held in Salem, and it's pretty bleak. There's no ventilation whatsoever. There's no heat in the winter. There's no way of cooling it in the summer either. In any event, that is a Salem jail where the accused was chained to the wall because the jailers believed that this would prevent the spirits from fleeing their jail cells and tormenting the victims. The accused were preliminarily questioned by a judge in front of a jury, which decided whether to indict or charge the person. If indicted, the accused had to decide right then and there whether to plead guilty or not guilty. And those who confessed to being a witch were sometimes spared the gallows. They, in turn, testified against others. And in the summer of 1692, remember this started in January, a cold January day, the pace of trials picked up. Many of the early accused were social outcasts, but with time, the net widened. One woman, Rebecca Nurse, seen here, who was a pious and respected woman, was accused of having had her specters attack certain individuals and demand they sign the devil's book. One of the key pieces of evidence against Nurse was that she had lectured a neighbor for allowing his pig into her garden where the pig uprooted her vegetables. Soon thereafter, the owner of the pig died, and this was considered evidence of her being a witch. Nurse was a member of a Topsfield family which had a long-standing quarrel with the Putnams. And now many of the community heard about Nurse's the accusation against a Nurse, and they signed a petition asking for her release. Indeed, the jury found Nurse not guilty. But Chief Justice Stoughton, who I showed a little while ago, was angered by the verdict, and he ordered the jury to go back to work and reconsider their verdict. They came back guilty, and Nurse, too, was carted off with 4 other convicted witches to Gallows Hill. After Nurse's execution, Salem's residents began to doubt the validity of the trials. Even ministers weren't off limits to accusations. The village's former minister had left Salem and indeed had relocated in Maine. Some accused him long distance of being the ringleader of the witches. And there he is, George Burroughs. At his execution, Minister Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which witches were considered incapable of doing, and the crowd was greatly moved. However, Cotton Mather intervened and told the crowd that the defendant minister had had his day in court and ought to be hanged. He was. In the fall of that fateful year, Salem's lust for blood was ebbing. People wondered how so many respectable people could be found guilty. The clergy and other educated people began to end the witch-hunting hysteria. Enter into our story Increase Mather, who was the father of Cotton Mather. Increase Mather, published a book called Cases of Conscience. It's amazing what you can find on the internet. And that book urged the court to exclude spectral evidence, the evidence of witches flying around and dreams and so forth. And now Mather's book, shown here, was presented to Governor Phipps, who ordered the exclusion of the spectral evidence and the touching tests and increased the burden on the government to prove its case by clear and convincing evidence. Now, in a criminal case, so that some of you who have, how many of you served on a jury? Okay, all right, a good number, about a third. There are 3 standards of evidence. Generally speaking, on the civil side, you have a preponderance of the evidence, meaning 51%. It has to be more likely than not. Then you've got clear and convincing. That preponderance of the evidence translates to about 51% certain of somebody's liable. Clear and convincing. We're not supposed to do this, but I'll just tell you, because I'm off the bench, so I can say, I have my First Amendment rights returned to me. I can say what I want. And it's almost always the truth. Clear and convincing evidence, you have to be certain about 85% of the time by the jury that it does. And beyond a reasonable doubt roughly translates, in my opinion, to be about 95% certain of someone's guilt. All right? So they were using really a preponderance of the evidence standard, like 51%, and then Governor Phipps changed that, and he increased the burden to the clear and convincing standard of about 85%. Now, of course, it didn't help the witch hunters case that at the time that just before Governor Phipps changed the rules of evidence and so forth, the accusers up in Salem accused the governor's own wife, Anna Phipps, of being a witch. I don't think he enjoyed going home that night. the governor disbanded the court of oyer and terminer, and the 52 remaining defendants were tried in a new court called the Superior Court of Judicature. All right, the Superior Court of Judicature. Over some centuries later, in the 1850s, the name was changed to simply the Superior Court, and that's the court on which I served. But the Judicature name was dropped. It was simply called the Superior Court. And most of the prisoners were then found not guilty under the new rules of evidence, or they were released for a lack of evidence. Those who were found guilty were pardoned, and the last few prisoners were released by the governor several months later. During this debacle, 29 people were convicted of witchcraft, of whom 19 were executed, 1 man was tortured to death, and 2 more died awaiting their trial. A period of atonement began in Salem. One of the judges issued a public confession of guilt and an apology, and several jurors admitted that they were mistaken in their judgment. Governor Phipps blamed the whole affair on Chief Justice William Stoughton. Stoughton, however, refused to apologize. Instead, he criticized the governor for political interference and, incredibly, claimed that he had just been about to clear the land of witches. And in perhaps the greatest irony of all, William Stoughton became the next governor of Massachusetts. Hence the town Stoughton. Yeah. So now we return to a myth about the reason for this human debacle. And we return to the poison rye bread theory. We need to examine that. The theory has been widely disseminated in the past 4 decades and just as widely criticized. And there are 8 reasons that undercut the ergot poisoning theory, and here they are. That's what it looks like. The theory was advanced by a graduate student out in California who had neither a medical nor a history background. Now, why is having a history research background important? Because the author of that paper was not trained or skilled at reading old documents and missed, according to experts, or ignored many prime materials that undercut the ergot poisoning theory. The second reason is that convulsive ergotism typically occurs in populations that are deficient in vitamin A. Let me go back to the ergot, the bread. But Salem was a major seaport, and at the time its residents consumed a lot of fish, which means that there was no vitamin A deficiency in this seaport town. The third reason is the most likely victims of ergot poisoning were small kids, but almost none of the accused were small children. There are also no historical reference to other ergotism typical symptoms such as discoloration or peeling skin or rotting of digits, meaning fingers and toes. It's also more likely that ergotism strikes animals, not humans, but there's little historical evidence to livestock dying. And the spread of the alleged disease was highly unusual. It struck only the girls in a family, not the boys. And it would only strike certain members of the household, not the entire family, even though they were probably eating the same food. Also, the last 2 reasons, ergot poisoning is usually accompanied by a ravenous hunger. No evidence of this whatsoever historically. And finally, ergotism causes long-term neurological damage. As to the surviving accused who were pardoned or spared, there is no evidence of neurological injury whatsoever. There is, however, an elephant in the room as to why people were so willing to embrace the ergotism theory. And it's called medicalizing the past. It's our desire as modern society to attribute unusual behavior to an underlying medical condition rather than to social or other possible factors. Now, in and of itself, medicalization is not wrong. Eating ergot-tainted bread may result in neuropathy and gangrene. but medicalizing the past to try to explain unusual behavior by blaming an undiagnosed medical condition is questionable. And the problem is twofold. First, it encourages us as a modern society to feel superior to the people of the past, because of course we know more than they did. And because of that superior knowledge, we couldn't possibly make the same mistakes they made. Oh, really? Look back at 2020 and 2021. I know one young man down in Washington, D.C., who was one of my student interns, who never left his apartment for a whole year. For a whole year. Now, this is a very bright young man. Probably too bright, I guess. But people did strange things. 6 feet, what difference does it make? Take the vaccine. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I was told that you would never get COVID, right? Well, I got it. I mean, there's very, very few people did anybody not get COVID? Wow, you must live. Look, there's only 6 of 50 of you who didn't get COVID. 5. Did you raise your hand? You did. But very unusual. Most of us got it, and most of us were vaccinated. I'm not against vaccines, but I thought I wasn't never going to get it. But in any event, so people made mistakes in 1692 Salem, and they made mistakes 4 or 5 years ago. So, in other words, if only the people of Salem understood ergotism better, all those innocent people wouldn't have died. And rather than explaining the past, medicalization often simply makes us feel better about ourselves, and it's a convenient way to explain aberrant behavior. And now second, assuming that we say what happened in Salem was because of a medical condition, that fails to explain why only some girls made the accusations, why the girls focused their accusations on certain people like older women rather than healthy young men, why town officials regarded these issues as necessary to convene a court of law to resolve, or why public executions were necessary. None of that is explained by this. So when we medicalize Salem, we miss the powerful social, economic, religious, and political dynamics that existed because we can assume that a simple medical condition explains everything that happened. Nearly all historians who've studied the witchcraft trials agree that the underlying issues were social, not physiological. Not physiological. So, were there any heroes in the Salem witchcraft tragedy? John Proctor was a local farmer who scoffed at the idea of witchcraft and accused the young girls of lying. He wrote to the clergy in Boston seeking help, knowing that many of them opposed the witches' trials. He told the people in Boston of the torture that was being inflicted and asked that the trials be moved to Boston, where he felt the accused could get a fair trial. As a result of his opposition, Proctor himself was accused of being a witch. The notion being that anyone who denied the existence of witches must, of course, be one themselves. Proctor's entire family was accused, his pregnant wife, children, and his sister-in-law. The Boston clergy held a meeting shortly after they received Proctor's letter, but they couldn't get help to Proctor in time. He was hanged, along with 5 others, and his wife Elizabeth was able to avoid execution only because she was pregnant. And this was called, in those days, a reprieve, quote, for the belly, end quote. Also, another hero is Giles Corey, who was a man in his 80s, accused of witchcraft. When asked to enter his plea, he refused. He knew that a conviction would result in the forfeiture of his large estate, and it wouldn't be passed down to his children. English law had a quick procedural response to such a situation. He was tortured in an attempt to force a plea out of him. The torture consisted of stripping him naked in a field, placing a board on top of him, and then loading heavy stones atop the board. with the weight gradually increasing until the prisoner either entered a plea or died. Corey withstood this torture for 3 days before he succumbed. 3 days. And Nathaniel Saltonstall, shown here, remember, had been appointed by the governor to the court of Oyer and Terminer, but resigned from the court after the first conviction. Another hero. Samuel Sewell was one of the judges appointed to the court of Oyer and Terminer. Sewell was perhaps the most remarkable among the judges involved in the trials in that he later regretted his role, going so far as to call for a public day of fasting, prayer, and reparations. He later believed that he had ruled on insubstantial evidence. And in January 1697, 7 years after the fact, he stood up in the meeting house he attended while his minister read out his confession of guilt. He was sobbing apparently so badly he couldn't read it, the document himself. And then Increase Mather, let's see, that's Sewell, there's Mather. He had a rather checkered involvement with this tragedy, but he did write a book called Cases of Conscience, and the book is considered America's first treatise on evidence. He urged the court to exclude spectral evidence, and his book was given to Governor Phipps, who ordered the court to exclude such evidence, exclude the touching tests, and require proof of guilt, remember, by clear and convincing evidence. So, what really happened in Salem? Obviously, there's no excuse for what happened, but we can try to explain the conditions that possibly led to this outburst of mass hysteria. The colonists lived a life of fear. There was a war with the native population raging, actually one of many that occurred in the 150 years before the American Revolution, and the war was raging just 70 miles from the settlements. Petty rivalries existed between families for control of the town, as well as the towns, and as well as the pulpit. And then, of course, we have the usual whole range of human emotions, dark emotions, I might add, jealousy, dislike of social outcasts, and even financial incentives, because the farmlands of those convicted of witchcraft, remember, were forfeited by conviction, which led to colonists seeking to profit from false accusations against people accused of witchcraft. And interestingly, Salem's widows, unlike other widows in the colonies at the time, had the right to control property in their own name. It was very unusual. So we have to wonder how many accusations of witchcraft leveled against women were financially motivated. We also have what can best be described as a miscellany of reasons. They were living through a desolate, isolating New England winter. We've all been through that. It's too long, right? Also, teenage boredom was a factor, and perhaps a simple desire for attention. All the simple underlays of the human condition. Now, there is one theory that I believe has great validity, and Tori Hatchett, in her program on October 31st at 2 o'clock downstairs in her book club, is going to address this. And it's why women were largely accused, largely, not exclusively accused. Feminist scholars have an additional theory, as I said, that has great validity. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony wrote in 1881 in their book, The History of Woman Suffrage, shown here, historically that it was women who were almost exclusively accused of being witches because men seemed to believe in the inherent wickedness of women. They didn't understand the mental or physical differences of the female sex, and as a result, they ascribed all those differences to witchcraft. And the clergy fostered the belief that women were in league with the devil, that, for example, a woman with a strong intellect or a high intellect or a strong personality were proof that she was in league with Satan. Modern scholars have also found that those most frequently accused were female inheritors, or women who ran successful businesses, or unmarried women, or women who hadn't born a son during their child-rearing years. And finally, witch hunting may have simply affirmed male authority at a time when women were asserting some degree of independence. We'll never know. What we do know is that this horrible human experience happened, and it all happened not very far from here, about 37 miles. So I'd like to conclude with a quotation that I think applies to the innocent people who were accused in the Salem tragedy, just as the same quotation applied during the World War II. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And finally, let me leave you on a lighter note. Of course, here is, I love this cartoon. It's a lawyer advising his client who's a witch or would-be witch. Remember, you're on trial for witchcraft, so try not to cackle and lose the hat. And here is probably the most famous witch of all. Now, does anybody know her name? Margaret Hamilton. Does anybody know what college she went to? Smith College. Does anybody know the politician with whom she had a torrid affair? James Michael Curley. Yeah, how about that? You came just to hear that, believe me. And as a matter of fact, Curley was going to run for Congress in '42, but the allegations were so strong, he didn't know how to rebut them, so he withdrew his name from the contest.
Was he married? Is that why?
Of course he's married. I mean, really. Yeah, no, of course he is. The politicians, they all fool around, Not all of them. 99.9% of them. It's all tied up in their ego. And finally, here is our most beloved television witch, Elizabeth Montgomery. Wasn't she wonderful? You remember that show?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Salem has a statue of her.
Now, some of you who attended the last lecture may not remember this, but I gave a lecture last month on the trial of Lizzie Borden. Some of you were here. And Elizabeth Montgomery was the sixth cousin of Lizzie Borden. How about that? So I want to thank the Friends of the Thayer Memorial Library. I met Suzanne from the last program that I did in September, and I joined up as a friend of the Lancaster Library. There's another witch, not you, but they're all coming out of the woodwork. It's like Ghostbusters here. And Tori and Rachel as well. Thank you very much.